welcome to the first Korean Church Conference on Developmental Disabilities. My name is Sean Lee, and I pastor the disability ministry here at ANC온누리 Church. I am so excited for the next 2 days. We have individuals from over 50 churches and organizations from across the country participating in this conference. Isn't that amazing? I believe this speaks to the great need and desire we have to learn how to better serve our churches and our communities. I hope and pray that the next 2 days are a time for us to learn, to encourage, to heal, and to be blessed. To start things off, I'd like to welcome someone very important to my ministry here at ANC. It is such a privilege to have a senior pastor that supports our ministry and understands our families with disabilities, especially since he is also a parent to one of our students, Hope. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the senior pastor of All Nations Church, Reverend Tae Kim.
찬전사님 감사합니다. 찬전사를 같이 사역할 수 있어서 저는 너무너무 좋고요. 아까 나이 든 사람들, 제일 나이 많이 들은 사람들 좀 하는 거는 좀 너무한 것 같아요. 여러분 2023년 발달장애 컨퍼런스로 ANC에서 할 수 있고 또 이 기회를 통해 많은 분들을 만날 수 있게 돼서 너무 반갑습니다. 지난 몇 개월 동안 진정 이 컨퍼런스에 사람들이 올까, 관심을 가져줄까 하는 의심이 있었던 것이 사실입니다. 하지만 리더십과 함께 의논하며 기도하며 또 이 주제에 대한 GBC미주복음방송의 열심과 관심에 대해서 저도 도전받았고 이제 이틀 동안 컨퍼런스 후에 헌신하게 돼서 하나님 앞에 너무너무 감사드립니다. 우리 샨전 선생님 말씀하신 것처럼 우리 발달장애 아이를 가진 부모로서 저는 이 주제를 매일 대하고 있는 것이 현실입니다. 그리고 이제 이것이 저 혼자만의 고민이 아니라서 위로받고 또 너무 감사합니다. 온 가족이 함께하는 배움이고 또 저에게는 이 ANC 교회 공동체가 섬겨주고 함께 사랑과 서포트를 하기에 얼마나 큰 도움과 또 에너지가 되는지 모르겠습니다. 그래서 여러분도 이번 컨퍼런스를 통해서 우리는 혼자가 아니라는 것을 꼭 알고 우리 가셨으면 좋겠어요. As a parent of a special needs child, there are days when it's tough to keep going and to keep hoping. And that is why I am so thankful for the church community to walk this journey with me and my family. God brings special people all around us to remind us of His love and presence. This weekend, I hope that you too will receive the same message. That you are not alone in this journey. Whether you are serving or dealing with this issue directly or struggling to understand how to cope or serve, we are all in this together. 오픈 마인드로 우리가 서로 축복하는 시간이 되길 원합니다. 이것을 위하여 우리 ANC 교회에서 많은 봉사자들이 자원하였으니 필요한 거 있으시면 꼭 여러분이 알려주시고 언제든지 저희들이 도움 드리도록 하겠습니다. All Nations Church is here to serve you during the conference. Please don't hesitate to ask for any help next 2 days. All of us know the special verse, Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. 로마서 8장 28절. 우리가 알거니와 하나님을 사랑하는 자, 곧 그 뜻대로 부르심을 입은 자들에게는 모든 것이 협력하여 선을 이루느니라. 여러분, 장애하면 참으로 많은 아픔과 상처가 있습니다. 하지만 이번 컨퍼런스를 통해 이 가운데 하나님이 어떻게 협력하여 선을 이루시는지 또 이것이 어떻게 교회 안에서 복음의 빛을 경험하고 나누는 기회가 되는지 알게 되는 이 배움과 기쁨의 시간이 되기를 주님의 이름으로 축복합니다. 자, 여러분 즐거운 시간, 또 함께 도전받는 시간이 되기를 함께 기도하면서 여러분과 함께 알아갈 수 있어서 너무너무 행복합니다. 오셔서 감사합니다.
Thank you, Reverend Kim. Next up, I have the privilege of introducing the person most responsible for making the vision of this conference into reality. For the last 30 years, this person has been a pioneer for the disability ministry in the Korean community. He is currently the president of KGBC Radio, and he also happens to be my father. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Reverend Young Sun Lee.
안녕하십니까 여러분. 오늘 발달장애 컨퍼런스에 참석하신 여러분을 환영합니다. 발달장애에 대한 열정과 희망으로 가득한 이 자리를 허락하신 하나님께 감사드리며 여러분과 이 자리에 함께 할 수 있어 기쁩니다. 무엇보다도 이번 컨퍼런스를 가능케 해주신 ANC온누리교회와 김태형 목사님, 사역자 한 분께 깊은 감사를 드립니다. 첫 번째, 우리는 모두가 한 목소리로 발달장애에 대한 인식을 높이고 함께하고자 이 자리에 모였습니다. 우리는 이 컨퍼런스를 통해 더 나은 이해와 지식을 얻은 것이며 이를 통해 우리는 교회와 사회가 더욱 포용적이고 하나님께서 주신 소명과 합당한 새로운 패러다임을 신앙 공동체에 정립할 수 있다고 믿습니다. 둘째, 발달장애 가진 분들과 그 가족들은 종종 힘들고 어려운 시간을 겪습니다. 그러나 그들은 희망을 가지고 끝없이 노력하며 우리는 그들을 격려하고 지원해야 합니다. 그들의 믿음과 인내력은 우리에게 큰 영감을 줍니다. 셋째, 우리는 발달장애 가진 분들의 능력과 잠재력을 인정해야 합니다. 그들은 우리의 교회와 사회에서 중요한 역할을 할 수 있으며 그들의 다양한 능력을 활용하여 우리 모두가 함께 성장할 수 있습니다. 마지막으로 우리는 사랑과 배려로 가득 찬 교회와 사회를 만들어 나가야 합니다. 발달장애 가진 분들과 그 가족들을 우리 공동체의 가족으로 받아들이고 그들과 함께 아름다운 공동체를 이루며 서로에게 더 많은 사랑을 나눌 수 있기 바랍니다. 이 컨퍼런스는 우리에게 희망을 주고 발달장애에 대한 인식을 확대하는 좋은 기회입니다. 함께 노력하고 협력하며 더 나은 미래를 위하여 함께 나갈 수 있기를 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Reverend Lee. At this time, it is my great privilege and honor to introduce a very special guest. Dr. Erik Carter is Luther Sweet Endowed Chair in Disabilities at Baylor University and Executive Director of the Baylor Center on Developmental Disabilities. His research and teaching focuses on strategies for promoting full participation, belonging, and valued roles in school, work, community, and congregational settings for children and adults with intellectual disabilities, autism, and multiple disabilities. Dr. Carter was formerly the Cornelius Vanderbilt Chair in Special Education at Vanderbilt University. His passion is helping churches, schools, and communities become places of membership and belonging for individuals with disabilities and their families. I first met Dr. Carter through his research on the current condition of disability ministries in churches across the country. When I first mentioned this conference to Erik back in April, I expected him to meet me with some degree of skepticism. However, he responded by saying that not only would he be happy to come, but that he felt he would learn a lot by being here. Dr. Carter, thank you so much for your humble heart and your generosity with your time. I am sure that we all will learn a lot by you being here. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Erik Carter.
a much delayed thank you for welcoming me so well. Thank you, Pastor Kim and Pastor Lee, for KGBC Radio, for the All Nations Church for hosting this event. What a joy it is to be with you. Among people all throughout this region, from all around the country, all the way from Thailand, who care deeply about creating communities where believing and belonging abound together. I'm so grateful for your love for the Lord and for your faithfulness in helping to change the local landscape wherever you are. Our conversation tonight will be about belonging. It's a simple but powerful word. We are called to share this assurance that we each belong to God and to nurture communities where we each belong to one another. Belonging is one of those things. We know the deep joy when we belong, and we know the deep hurt when we don't. And no one in the church should ever wonder whether they really do belong. Now, the younger 18-year-old version of me, which wouldn't have won the gift card, I guess, would have been surprised that I'm talking on this topic right now at age 50. You see, I grew up in the absence of people with developmental disabilities, or so it seemed. As I think back to my childhood, young people with Down syndrome or autism were never really part of the classes that I took in school. They weren't part of the clubs I was part of or the jobs I had as a teenager, and maybe the same was true for you. And so a career focused on promoting inclusive disability ministry was the last thing on my young mind. But that all changed the summer after my freshman year of college when I stumbled into some new relationships with several young men and women with intellectual disability at a mountain camp, like the one you'll see up on the screen. Relationships that I otherwise probably would not have pursued. You see, faith and disability were the furthest things from my young mind at the time. But how quickly I became captivated by friendships with a young man named Wayne and a young woman named Margaret and another named John Ray. And as a young person who thought that my worth was measured most in my accomplishments and my achievements, they befriended me just because I was. Not because of what I could do or what I knew or where I went to college, but just because. And I experienced belonging in those friendships. And it changed so much of what I thought mattered most as a young person. But through those friendships, I also encountered the testimonies of Wayne and Margaret and John Ray and their deep love for Jesus. John Ray couldn't speak, and Wayne struggled sometimes with words, but their faith was deep and certain. They worshiped with glad abandon. They trusted without reservation. They knew for certain that they belonged to God. And how much I longed to have that same assurance. And so I followed their lead and their testimony and gave my life to Christ. And that shouldn't be a surprising story. It's an ordinary story of how God's grace flows through all of God's people to transform his lives. All of God's people. No asterisks, no exceptions. But it's still a rare story today because our lives still so rarely intersect in our schools, in our workplaces, and in our churches. How could we become communities where the friendship and the faith and the gifts of people with and without disabilities are shared and received and celebrated? And so I'd like to share an answer that emerges from the research I've been involved with over the last 30 years, where we strive to understand what it means to create churches where believing and belonging abound together for all people, whether it's young people with disabilities or anyone who finds themselves on the outside looking in. We're called to be the kinds of churches and communities that embrace more readily than we exclude. So to set the stage for what I'm going to share, I want to share a little bit of history that may or may not be familiar to many of you. And I'm going to use my own lifespan as a time frame for this. I think I'm very, very young, but my kids say I'm very, very old. I turned 50 in a couple months. And if you just think about the 50 years of my lifespan, at the time that I was born, kids with disabilities were prevented from going to their local public schools, to being part of workplaces and their neighborhoods and so many other activities. If you think about this image up on the screen, as a community, there were holes. Communities were incomplete. People with disabilities were missing. As I started to grow up in elementary school and middle school in the 70s and the 80s, new spaces and new programs were begun for children and adults with developmental disabilities, new places to learn and work and live and recreate. But those opportunities were almost always provided in separate settings with no one else without the same disability label. It was kind of the de facto choice made without even ever meeting you. And so in most communities, everyday life was still lived apart from people with developmental disabilities. In the 1990s and the 2000s, the shift was towards making sure people with developmental disabilities could be integrated into ordinary parts of community life. Schools and businesses and churches and community programs opened up all around the country, but so many of those opportunities still had a certain separation that was part of them. Different classes or different ministries that placed people with developmental disabilities near, but not really among other people without disabilities. And there's a big difference between being near one another and being among one another. Which takes us to the present day, where so much of our attention is focused on the inclusion of people with developmental disabilities in the same classrooms and clubs and colleges and church activities and community groups as anyone else. We talk about inclusion so often now. It's a movement of being apart from one another to being among one another to now being with one another. And these are very different pictures of communities that you see up on your screen. And the reason I share this is for a couple reasons. Even though I said this was past history, what we see up on the screen is actually what we see presently right now in churches and communities all around the country. There are churches that exclude people with disabilities, churches that separate people with disabilities, and a growing number of churches that include people with disabilities. So this is the portrait of so many churches in our midst right now, and it raises the point of reflection for us. Which of these pictures of community reflect our church or our community? But the other reason that I share these pictures is I think there's one more picture we need to put up here. There's something more than just being integrated in a community that matters. There's something about more than just being included in a community that matters. People want to experience real belonging. We long to belong. And there's something different about a community that is marked by belonging. In those kinds of communities, we see each other in very different ways. Not as the members and the strangers, not people who are labeled and people who are not labeled, not people who are in and people who are out, but we are one single community. Diverse, absolutely, but every person an image bearer and of immeasurable worth. But it also means that we don't just see one another differently. We also relate to one another differently. A church that's marked by belonging doesn't just have people sharing space on Sunday, they have people who share their lives together. We become knitted together and woven into relationships. And we stay involved in each other's life after class ends, after work, we clock out of work, after we end church services all 7 days of the week. There's a difference between inclusion and belonging. We often say it's the difference between being present in a place and having a real presence in that place. The difference between welcoming people when they arrive and actually aching because of their absence, pursuing people who aren't yet there. Are our Christian schools and our communities and our churches that kind of place of belonging? And how will we know that we've arrived? Well, there are many ways to answer this question. And I want to share with you in the rest of my time something that we've learned from the lived experiences of hundreds of young people with developmental disabilities and their families who've been part of our projects. When we ask them about their experience of belonging in their church and in their community and what tells them that they belong, they've shared that they know they belong when 10 things are in place. They know they belong when they're present, when they're invited, when they're welcomed, and when they're known, when they're accepted, when they're supported, when they're cared for, when they're befriended, when they're needed, and when they're loved. And this isn't the list of everything that matters. It's not a recipe. But these are things that point us to reflection in our churches. What are we doing to make sure that people in our midst who have disabilities experience each of these things that I've shared? To mutually welcome, to mutually accept, to care for, to mutually befriend. There's reciprocity in all of this. So let me highlight each, because I think there's a lot of work for us to do in the church. And I'm going to start with presence, because belonging always begins with being present. It's really hard for anyone to feel part of a community if you're looking from the outside in. And so many other aspects of belonging are hard to experience from a distance or from the outside. It's hard to be known and befriended and needed and cared for if you aren't really even there. And our cities and our neighborhoods are filled with people who are experiencing disability. In the United States, if 1 in every 7 children, about 15% of your community, has a disability that impacts their learning or their relationships. About 1 in 5 adults identifies as being disabled. And the numbers vary a little bit from community to community, but they hold up pretty well. Our communities are filled with people with disabilities, but are our churches filled with people with disabilities? What stands in the way of people being present in our churches? Now, a long time ago, the primary challenge to getting to a church was physical accessibility. I, a lot of times in presentations, share my collection of the most inaccessible churches in the whole world. And this is one of those examples. It's a church built into the side of a mountain with thousands of steps. And then I would share these at conferences, and people would send me pictures of even more inaccessible churches. Like this one in Italy that's up on the top of a mountain. And I think that this is the most inaccessible church I've ever found in the world. Only actually, technically, it's a monastery, and only one person lives there. But it's very difficult to get in. And those pictures usually make people laugh, like they did you as well. But I wonder what our buildings communicate about our theology, about what we believe. What do those steps say that lead up to our church? The pulpit that someone can't get to. The classroom that's not accessible for some kids. The curriculum that doesn't work for some kids. Does where we gather on Sunday and how we gather suggest that we might be thinking too narrowly about our community, even if we don't mean to? Maybe there's other barriers beyond architecture. Barriers of attitude or awareness. Barriers of our expectations or even our theology and our values. What can we do to remove those barriers so people can be present in community? Presence is the starting point for belonging, but it's not our stopping point. It reflects ministry among people with disabilities, but we are called to go deeper than that. And so often, if we're going to ensure that people are present, it begins with extending new invitations. This is the second aspect of belonging that we've heard from families and people with disabilities. To be invited, to be pursued, to be sought out. So rather than waiting or hoping that people with disabilities will come into our congregations, we are out in our communities pursuing the presence of people with disabilities. And what a difference it would make if we did much more inviting. And this is what the scriptures say we're supposed to do. We are called to invite. The great banquet in Luke 14 isn't set for a select few. God's design for the body is so much grander than our own. We're supposed to invite people who never get invited out, to people who reside in overlooked places, and to invite where no one else is inviting, with this wonderful, irresistible offer that fills the very house of God. But those invitations were very rare for my friends like Wayne and Margaret and John Ray. It says a lot when churches and Christian schools are out on the forefront of inviting people with disabilities. But it also says a lot when we are not leading that charge. And those kinds of invitations are still rare for many people with disabilities in our midst. In one national study, they found that half of all teenagers with autism had never been invited to any other kid's social activity in the last year. Half of all teenagers never were invited to any other parties or sleepovers or anything by anyone else. And that was true for 1 in 4 young people with Down syndrome. What would those numbers look like in our community? And what could our role be in the church in changing those outcomes? If we're not intentional about reaching out throughout our community, we inadvertently leave people out. And I love this quote from a pastor who realized that people with disabilities aren't present in my church. It's not because we deliberately excluded people with disabilities. In fact, we weren't deliberate at all, and that was the problem. And I'm worried that kind of quote still characterizes what we see. Certain people remain an afterthought, but we want people to be a forethought. And so we have to be doubly deliberate. Our invitation should abound, and they should endure, and when they do, belonging is much more likely to follow. Which takes us to the third dimension of belonging, which is to be welcomed. And it's wonderful how remarkable it is that Jesus welcomes us into relationship with Him. And as God's people, we should have that kind of reputation too. The reputation for welcoming well. Because the way people are greeted and treated by others in our church says a lot about their place in the community. And to be welcomed is to be received warmly, with delight, where people find pleasure in our presence. And it's often through ordinary gestures that people come to feel welcomed. It means greeting people when they arrive and knowing their names, asking about their week, introducing them to other people, drawing them into conversations, inviting them to church events and other events, remembering when their birthday is, and celebrating it well, inviting them to your small group, and just noticing when they're not there and following up to find out why. It's just ordinary actions that sends a message to people that we feel like we're welcomed, that we're wanted. And no one should ever wonder whether they're wanted in our communities. And I think this really matters so much because from our studies, we found that the church stories of families impacted by disability are not always ones of extravagant welcome. Sometimes those stories are of heartbreak and wounding. In one of our studies, we found that 1 in 3 families left their church because their child with disabilities wasn't welcomed or included. 1 in 3 families has left their church. How can we widen our welcome in ways that make people feel truly wanted in our communities? Well, the fourth aspect of belonging involves being known. And this is not just about people knowing your name, although that's really important. It's about not just the joy of being noticed and recognized, it's about being understood deeply and personally. To be known is to be seen as a person uniquely created by God and appreciated by others for all of who you are. And as Christians, we're called to welcome the stranger. It's part of the practice of hospitality. But it's also the case that people shouldn't remain strangers for very long. Right? And yet too many people with developmental disabilities feel like they're in the role of being a stranger in our community. They're known about, but they're not known personally. But this is not just actually about how people are known, or whether people are known, it's also about how people are known. And so often when we think about disability, we focus only on what someone cannot do or struggles to do. Like John Ray can't walk, my friend Wayne struggles to talk, or Margaret finds it hard to read. That's often all that the world sees, and it's often all they see. But that's an incomplete way to know people within the body of Christ. That's a view that flattens people's portrait. And yet there's a different way to know people with developmental disabilities, as people who have strengths and gifts and passions and perspectives that they bring to relationships and that they bring to communities. By the things that remind us that every single person is absolutely indispensable. You see, when we're committed to belonging, we do that one person at a time. We seek to learn each person's story. We strive to understand their interests, their skills, their talents, their sense of calling from God. And we strive to see people as God sees them, as beautiful and as a new creation, as very good, as called by name, as fearfully and wonderfully made. As we come to know each person with developmental disabilities in that very countercultural way, now we're positioned to support and befriend and meet and love each person well. Well, it's one thing to be included, it's quite another to be accepted. And real acceptance comes from being known personally. Not just from someone knowing about you, but someone knowing you personally. And when we talk with parents about the markers of inclusion for their children with disabilities, they talk about their daughters and sons being welcomed without condition and treated like family and embraced for all of who they are. And those are the things we want to hear over and over and over from families. But that's not always what families hear from their church. Sometimes they hear quotes like, "We're just not equipped to serve your son. We don't really do inclusion here. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at another church that has a program for your daughter. Her behaviors are a bit of a distraction." Those are the kinds of quotes that reveal a different set of attitudes and expectations regarding who belongs in a particular community. And no one should ever wonder whether there's a place for them in our churches. Our attitude should be strikingly different, right? We're supposed to have the mindset of Christ Jesus. And we know that there's ways to change attitudes in our congregations. We know there's a place for sharing information and providing education related to disability. We can host activities that raise awareness and create understanding. And there's power in what we model and the stories we tell about people. But the primary way we change attitudes about anyone is through fostering friendships and other shared activities. It's when people stumble into relationships with one another that their ideas about that person, their preconceived ideas about whoever is a stranger, start to get overturned. And that's what really we're trying to do, is how do we help people stumble into relationships that they might not have otherwise pursued, and their attitudes about people with developmental disabilities start to change. The sixth dimension of belonging is the need for support. And that's a universal experience. We were never meant to go it alone. And support for one another should be abundant within the body of Christ. A ride to church events, accessible materials, help from a peer, the right technology or flexibility in our expectations. The right supports make participation possible. It's a tangible way that we say, we want you here. This is the place for asking really good questions. We don't want to make assumptions. We want to ask families, what could we do to make Sunday morning the best day of the week for your family? What could we do to welcome your family really well? And so we want to make sure we're intentional about providing people the support they need to be part of everything that's offered in the life of our church. Our Sunday school programs, our youth programs, our adult programs, our potlucks and social events. We want to make sure supports are there because supports make participation possible. Communities that are committed to belonging see this provision of support as essential. It's never optional, but they go even further than that. They start to put supports in place as a forethought rather than as an afterthought. In other words, they put in supports for people with disabilities even before people with disabilities start showing up. Well, seventh, healthy communities are marked by deep care for one another. We are called to look out for the interests of our brothers and sisters, to bear one another's burdens, and receiving care from others in your church is a way that assures you that you matter to others and that you belong. And so the opportunity here is to think about how do we care for one another, not just for a few hours on Sunday morning, but all 7 days of the week. How do we support families and individuals with disabilities between Sundays, not just on Sundays? And this is a place where we can be creative and really imaginative as the church. There are so many ways we're seeing churches provide care related to things like employment and housing and transportation. It's ordinary things like helping a fellow member with disabilities find a job that reflects their calling, connecting them to safe or affordable housing, helping them get around town, providing a ride, stopping by to check in, helping someone with a bill, calling to say hello, helping with housework, or just being present together. And none of those things that I just mentioned require any expertise related to disability. They're just part and parcel of what we do for one another as the body of Christ. Well, eighth, belonging is rooted in relationships. It's about having people in our lives who know us and love us and accept us and need us and miss us. And that desire for friendships is a universal need. It's not a special need, and And it's grounded in this core belief that we are created for community. And as we learn very early in the scriptures, it's not good to be alone. And all of the other things I've talked about can be addressed in the absence of close relationships. You can support someone, you can accept someone, you can welcome someone, but friendships take belonging much deeper. Having a friend in your life means there's someone who says, I choose you back. And it's just not good to be alone. On the screen are more data from that study that I mentioned earlier. We found that 74% of youth with autism never get telephone calls or text messages from friends, and half, 44%, haven't gotten together with other kids in the past year. We talk now a lot in our country about loneliness being epidemic and isolation abounding. And that's true for so many people, but it's particularly true for many young people with developmental disabilities. And it's something that we can do something about as a church. We can make sure that every person with developmental disabilities in our midst has someone that they can eat with, and walk with, and celebrate with, and cry with, and pray with, and play with, and shop with, and watch the game with, or just do nothing with. Relationships have to be at the heart of anything that we call inclusion. And it's not inclusion if no one else in that church knows her name. And it's not really a faith community if there's no community for everyone in the midst. So how do we introduce relationships into the picture? We have to be really, really intentional about providing opportunities for people to meet one another, to spend time together, to connect together around shared interests and common interests and experiences, and to do that over time. And when we do that, people start to pick one another as friends. And I think this also has implications for how we think about ministry and schooling related to people with developmental disabilities. If our main models of ministry are separate, then the opportunity to be picked as a friend becomes very limited. And the opportunity for everyone else in the church to encounter the faith and the gifts and the talents and the faith of people with disabilities also becomes limited. And that takes us to the 9th dimension of belonging. The richest forms of community are marked by a real reciprocity among members. Every person is seen as having gifts and talents and strengths that benefit the entire body. And we know as Christians that every person in our midst has immeasurable worth. But we also know that not every person in our midst feels valued. And so much of contemporary society struggles to see the ways that people with developmental disabilities enrich and enliven our communities. And so when a church sees people with disabilities as absolutely indispensable and even crucial to the flourishing of the body, that is so countercultural to what the world sees or thinks. Being part of a community that knows your gifts and seeks out your gifts and finds a place for your gifts, that gives you the assurance that you belong. And all of us want to know that our presence matters in a community, that we're needed by others, and that our absence evokes this longing for our return. I'm convinced that a healthy church can find a place for every single gift. So are we developing the gifts and talents of people with developmental disabilities just like we would for anyone else? And then are we looking for places for them to use those gifts and talents to serve other people? Sam's beautiful voice should have a place in the choir. Javier's contagious smile should be on the greeting team. Evan's obsession with detail would be really helpful on our setup team. And Aiden's servant spirit would be really helpful in the homeless ministry. And Neva's faithfulness would enrich the prayer team. The presence of a disability doesn't diminish any person's gifting. Every single person is called to serve one another with the gifts that they've been given. And I think back often to the 18-year-old version of me and how grateful I am that I met Wayne and Margaret and John Ray, and that they accepted me, and that they befriended me, and that they welcomed me, and that they shared their faith so unreservedly with others, and that they embraced and loved someone like me. See, I think that was ministry by people with developmental disabilities. 3 people who I think society would overlook as promising avenues through which Jesus might call others to himself. And yet the opposite was exactly true. It was their gifts and their faith that were just as real and just as attractive, just as much an avenue for God's life-changing grace. And how much I would have missed out on if I had never encountered their friendship and their testimony. And how many people will go their entire lives never meeting or really getting to know this segment of their community? How many people will miss the opportunity to receive their ministry? I collect pictures of inaccessible churches. I also collect pictures of church signs, which I'm glad to show you my collection sometime. But this is one of my favorites. I don't know what the pastor was thinking when they put this church sign together, but it suggests to me the posture that I wish every church and every ministry would adopt as they think about a community that includes people with developmental disabilities. We need you here ASAP, as soon as possible. And the references to 1 Corinthians 12, that image of the beautiful body where every member matters, whether or not that body, every member matters. Well, the last of these dimensions of belonging is love. And you don't need a professor from Baylor to tell you what love has to do with belonging. We know this firsthand, right? We go the extra mile for people we love. We make allowances and exceptions for people we love. We sacrifice our interests for people we love. We work for the good of others that we love. And love is the thing that leads us to care about somebody's flourishing all 7 days of the week. After the final hymn is sung and we've left this building, it's love that keeps us connected and keeps us invested in each other's lives. And when people talk about the communities that matter most to them, they talk about the love that they encounter there. In other words, where love abounds, belonging is much more likely to be experienced. We were made to love and to be loved, and the scriptures remind us over and over that everything we do must be marked by love. And if it sounds a little bit like I'm preaching, I would just add the greatest of all these dimensions is also love. And this is the message that people with developmental disabilities so desperately want to hear. It's the message that all of us so desperately want to hear, that you are valuable, that you are as valuable as any other person, and that you are loved by those around you. And so this is a message that we're called to proclaim as Christians, not merely with our words, but through our relationships. Love is to be felt, not merely to be heard. And how can we be communities marked by that kind of love? This is what we've learned from our work with people with developmental disabilities and their families. And we'll keep this up on the screen for a minute because I think this is the kind of reflection that we want to do in our churches. As we think about where we worship, are those with disabilities personally invited? Are they present in all aspects of what we do in our church? Are they experiencing an extravagant welcome whenever they arrive? Are they known well? And are they well known in our communities? Are they accepted without condition, without caveat? Are they provided the support they need to be part of everything that we offer through our church? Are they cared for all 7 days of the week? Are they developing friendships with others throughout the church? Not just those who volunteer in the ministry, but friendships with everyone throughout the church. Are they seen as needed and indispensable? And are they loved deeply and unconditionally? I think this is a really powerful picture of what we want all of our churches to be like. Not just for people with disabilities, but for anyone in our midst. I hope this resonates with you because it's what we want for every member of our church. It turns out this was not a conversation only about developmental disabilities. I think this is a window into what we all want. Belonging isn't a special need for some people, it's a universal need for everyone. And we do all of these things in response to God's incredible generosity to us because we belong to God. We love because we have been loved. We befriend because we've been befriended. We care for others because we've been cared for, and on and on and on. So I hope this is a time for you to think about what this might look like in your church. As you think about those 10 parts of belonging? What are you doing really well in your church right now that you want to celebrate and keep doing? And how do you know that you're doing well in those areas? Are you reflecting on that? Maybe you heard something that you might do better or differently, and maybe you're starting to catch a vision of what you might do next in your community. So let me close by returning back to those series of images that I put up earlier and ask which of those 5 portraits of community reflect the communities that you work in, or that you live in, or that you worship in. And how can you be a catalyst for change in your church, or in your neighborhood, or anywhere else, to help communities become places where belonging really does abound? I think this is a calling for all of us and an invitation for us as well, to help our church widen its welcome in ways that lead to people being befriended and needed and loved. So let me thank all of you for your love for the Lord, for your desire to reach every person for Christ without exceptions, without asterisks. And let me close us in prayer. Lord, may we invite others as you have invited us. And may we welcome others as you've welcomed us. May we befriend as you've befriended us. And may we love others the way you've loved us. We are in awe of the great lengths you've gone to pursue each one of us. Thank you that we belong to you. Amen.